Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this Examination Skills webinar brought to you by the Institute of Risk Management. My name is Stephen Wellings, and I'll be providing support during the webinar, but your main presenter is Dr. Phil Kelly, who's not only a risk management specialist and practitioner, but also an experienced tutor and principal examiner for IRM. I'll be introducing him to you shortly. The webinar has been designed to give your study and examination skills a really helpful kickstart by explaining clearly what IRM and its examiners are looking for in the examinations, and by giving you lots of useful ideas and tips which you can take away and apply immediately. The webinar is being recorded, so you can watch and listen to it again online as many times as you like. We'll send you a link to the recording tomorrow. Right now, I'd like to take you through a few pointers about how we plan to run the webinar. We'll be asking you some questions as the webinar progresses to help you gauge your understanding of some of the topics, and you'll be asked to respond to the question by using the polling feature, which should pop up on your screen at the appropriate moment. We've had a number of questions sent to us by participants in advance of the webinar, but you can also ask some further questions as the webinar progresses, using the questions feature at any time. Phil will address as many of these questions as possible towards the end of the webinar. Your responses during polling and any questions you ask will all be anonymous. Please make sure your questions are likely to be of interest to all participants. We obviously can't respond to queries about individual problems or matters in a forum like this. Right at the end of the webinar, we'll be reminding you about some of the other resources which you can access to help you as you prepare for the examinations. And finally, there will be a very brief survey for you to complete immediately after the webinar. As I said earlier, our main presenter is Dr. Phil Kelly. Phil is Senior Lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. He has a Master's in Teaching and Learning and has published work in this field and is a University Prize winner. He's a Fellow with the Institute and a Principal Examiner for Module 3. He's been an examiner for 15 or more years. He's owned and managed 2 risk consultancies on a global scale himself, so he's more than just an academic, he's a practitioner as well. He has a doctorate in risk management from Manchester Business School and is the author of a best-selling management textbook. I'll hand over to Phil now. Welcome, Phil.
Welcome everybody, and many thanks to Steve for the introduction. Apologies for the photograph. I'll move on from this slide shortly. I hope to share my experience as an examiner with you all today. Having taken and marked examinations, I now realize the importance of understanding examiner expectations. This session will help you to understand what these are and hopefully therefore improve your assessment outcomes. We will consider general IRM examination expectations, how to understand expectations for a specific module. We'll chat about examination preparation, show how to analyze and answer exam questions, and finally I will explain the marking process for you. It's always useful to try and see things from the examiner's perspective. For example, believe it or not, we are only human. We have no extra special powers of reading bad handwriting and are unable to see into your mind only what is written on the examination paper. As I go through the slides, with each slide I'll give you a little time to read it before I then explain it. Stephen, could you pass me the control now and I'll take over for the slides.
There we go, Phil.
Thank you. Okay. Each module of the diploma is set at an equivalent level to a postgraduate qualification. That means in many cases people will have already done a first degree. Many of the IRM examiners work or have worked in various universities, and they draw upon this knowledge and experience as best practice when designing IRM's teaching, learning and assessment environment. The structure of this qualification is very similar to the structure of a master's degree without the dissertation, i.e. it is mainly the talk component that you would expect to find on that kind of degree. The diploma is made up of a number of modules, as you can see on the slide, and each module takes between 180 and 200 hours of student effort. Many universities use a credit system to help structure their programs. Typically, 1 credit equates to about 10 hours of study, and they use this as a kind of international currency to compare qualifications around Europe and the world. This practice enables mobility for students, often allowing them to get recognition for study in one program or another. The two most important points of this slide you're looking at now are as follows. Firstly, it helps set expectations about the level of study. And so it is important to understand what postgraduate means, how it may differ from undergraduate study, for example, and we will consider this question shortly. Secondly, it helps set expectations about how much work you should be doing. We are not all the same, but the average person should be studying each IRM module for around 200 hours. I would advise you provisionally allocate proportions for reading each unit and then similarly for revising each unit within the module you're studying. And finally, you'll need to allot some time for examination preparation. Modules tend to be structured as 6 study units, but this can vary. And so this equates to approximately 30 hours per unit. The depth of your examination question answers should reflect this amount of reading. Okay, let's think about the assessment requirements and the range of modules on the diploma. We will all be at different stages in the diploma and we'll take on different numbers of modules as we progress through. It's normal within higher education to vary the assessment strategy as students move through the diploma. The IRM approach is grounded in the idea that initial modules, the first couple of modules, are pitched more at what we think of as the memory recall level. Later modules assess higher order thinking in terms of critical thinking in particular. We make use of a highly regarded framework. You may have heard of it. It's called the Bloom taxonomy to structure this approach. And throughout IRM, we've created a list of examination keywords that I'll talk about throughout the slides. In the meantime, it's worth noting the different assessment requirements of the modules with different expectations. So the advice I'll give today will be more relevant in some modules, and there'll be different issues in other modules. Another difference that you might notice as you progress through the diploma is the move towards the use of case studies in examinations. Case studies help examiners to test whether students have the ability to apply theoretical concepts in practice. And this is an important issue for IRM as a practitioner-focused institution. Okay, let's have a look at the assessment policy. I'll just give you a couple of moments to read the slide. Examination is founded on a number of key principles. Two of the important ones, validity and transparency, are shown on the slide. Both of them should mean that the examination should not contain any big surprises for you. You will only be assessed on the learning outcomes and your attainment of those outcomes and the associated module content that you've been presented with. The principles can therefore help set your expectations in terms of what you need to study, read, and demonstrate an understanding of. They help you focus on the module learning outcomes and content in the knowledge that this is what the examiner will expect you to understand. And it is this understanding that you have to demonstrate for yourself in the examination. So thinking about how the examinations are designed and the important issues of the different examinations that you may take within IRM. I have two things to say here. Firstly, a quality examination will only assess attainment of the specified learning outcomes. This can be used to help you when you're revising. You should ask yourself, have I attained this learning outcome? Have I attained all of the learning outcomes for this module? For example, if the module learning outcome states, explain how risk assessment supports risk evaluation and decision making, having revised the topic, you should then ask yourself whether you can actually explain what is required. As the learning outcomes are important to assessment, it is worth understanding how they are constructed, the meaning of key verbs like explain, and once again this is used to set expectations. Secondly, it is worth noting that the examiner makes use of marking criteria to guide their judgment. So you should use the allocated marks for question parts to guide expectations about how much to write. They often contain clues about how many points to make, for example. There are a number of important resources for you to help you in your journey to the examinations. I've already talked about the importance of module learning outcomes, and they are contained within the study guide. Study resources such as textbooks and articles form the knowledge base to attain the outcomes. All are important because they are used by the examiner when setting an examination. When I set an examination, I first consider the learning outcome and study unit that I will base the question on. Next, I look at what you should have read. I then consider the whole set of readings that you have and use all of this to create a question. It will always be possible to answer the question from the content of the resources you have. This means quite simply, you must read and study them if you want to pass the examination. You'd be surprised at how many students seem to take examinations without demonstrating they have read the resources. And the key word there is demonstrating they have read the resources. They seem to think that they can pass the examination from the experience or their experience of risk management. However, you're not being assessed on your extensive experience of risk management, no matter how great this is. You are being assessed on whether you have attained the specific learning outcomes for the module. And it is for you to demonstrate that you understand and can apply the theories presented in those resources. So I've already mentioned Bloom's taxonomy, and I'll just spend a little amount of time now putting that in a bit more detail. The taxonomy is widely used in education around the world. The taxonomy essentially creates levels to categorize the sophistication of our thinking. Lower levels simply indicate the ability to recall and remember information. They are often used in lower levels of study, such as undergraduate work and first degrees. Higher levels, represented by critically analyze, evaluate, and create on the slide, are associated with higher degrees, like master's degrees and beyond. And there is an expectation that at this level you can think more critically and are able to apply theory in practice, make judgments, analyze, and evaluate. In simple terms, your brain has to do more work at this level, and this is what we think of as the postgraduate level. The taxonomy is applied in the wording of the learning outcome and then in the examination question. So I'd encourage you to, and I'll do this later with you, to have a look at the learning outcomes and examination questions with this in mind. Thus, a question or outcome that starts with identify or list expects you to simply recall things, whereas an outcome that asks you to evaluate will expect you to form a judgment. You will need to set out arguments of viewpoints with supporting reasoning and evidence. Consider alternatives, strengths and weaknesses of arguments, and evidence of them to form a conclusion. As you can see, more thinking is required to do that kind of activity than simply list or recall things. You can find a copy of examination command words based on Bloom's taxonomy in your student handbook. If you look at Appendix 1 in that handbook, there is a table of those terms with an explanation of what they mean. There is also some good advice on preparing for your examinations in Part 6 of the handbook. Okay, so we've talked about some aspects of the examination, its design, and some aspects of the wording. What I want to spend a little bit of time on is your preparation for the exam, and think about the factors that might affect your performance. We are all different and will prepare for examinations in different ways. I've listed a selection of key factors that affect performance for some people. It is not only important to know the subject, it's also important to be able to demonstrate your knowledge within the time available. This makes your understanding of expectations, time management, and writing skills important. Have a look at the 5 different factors on the screen. Which do you think are most important? In a moment, I'll give you the opportunity to select one, and we can do a poll of everybody listening. So in a few seconds, a different window will load on your screen, and it will give you the opportunity to select 1 subject knowledge, 2 exam practice, and so on. And what I'd like you to do is participate and select one of the items that you think is the most important in terms of preparing for an examination. As was said by Stephen earlier on, these are anonymous, so don't worry about it, and we'll use this to explore what people are thinking right now. So I'm going to launch the poll in a second. If you could then make your selection. Okay, the poll is open, so if you can make your selections. I can see you're doing that now. Well done. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in a few seconds, so if you haven't yet clicked an answer, then maybe you could do that now. Okay, I'll close the poll now. Okay, some interesting responses there that I'll share with you. Just have another little think about what you thought were the most important factors, and these are the results that came through. So interestingly, most of you thought that understanding the examiner expectations was key to examinations, and hence why many of you are here on the webinar. Also widely recognized was the need for subject knowledge. The way that you use your time is important, and I'll talk about that later, but also exam practice and writing skills. Okay, I'm going to hide that now, and I suggest you hide it on your own screens as well at the same time as we return to the presentation. In reality, all of these factors are very important, and I think that was partly reflected in your selections. When preparing for the examination, you therefore need to think about each of these factors and action them. Let's move on then to talk more about exam questions and how to analyze them, and to understand, as many of you recognized in that previous slide, examiner expectations. So what is the examiner looking for? Perhaps the most important aspect of the examination is the need for you to demonstrate you have attained the learning outcomes. This means that you should not assume the examiner knows what is in your head. You have to put it down on paper, and my advice is state the obvious. It's for you to demonstrate that you know it and pretend the examiner doesn't know it and you're telling them. Okay, I'll give you a second to have a look at this slide. We will take a look at some questions in a few slides. Examination questions will often contain key verbs, the command verbs, such as define, describe, discuss, explain, identify, evaluate, analyze, and each of these has a meaning that is used by the examiner to communicate some expectations with you. The question itself will often make use of our specialized risk vocabulary as well. In many cases, it will be necessary for you to first define the meaning of these key concepts, and as I said earlier, use the mark scheme in order to gauge the importance of each part of the question. That is, how much time to spend on it and how much to write within it. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes to read this one, as there are a few words for you to get through. Earlier, I mentioned critical thinking. This is a key attribute of higher order thinking and postgraduate study, and it is a key aspect of the diploma at IRM as well. You need to understand what it means if you are to demonstrate that you can do it. There are quite a lot of complicated definitions and explanations of what it means, but put simply, it means questioning things and not blindly accepting things. Not just responding to what you read in one article or one book, but reading things in multiple sources and questioning what you're reading, not simply accepting everything you read as the complete and utter truth. Often this means considering theories in different contexts. Somebody may have written about risk management from one discipline, maybe like finance or something, whereas somebody may have written about it from another discipline like project management, and they'll have different perspectives on it. And when you're thinking critically, you'll realize and recognize this and make allowances for the direction they're coming from with their literature. It may mean recognizing weaknesses within theories or anything used as evidence of someone's argument. They may say that statistics show a certain thing, yet they only asked 10 people. And these are things that indicate your critical thinking when you realize that the knowledge being presented to you may be erroneous in some ways and that you question it. So I would advise you spend a little time thinking about what critical thinking is. Do a little research of your own and try and think when you're writing your essays, particularly as you progress through the diploma, how you are demonstrating it in what you write. Okay, in terms of you now actually writing the examination essay that many of you will be doing in a few weeks' time. As you progress through the diploma, the examination questions will require you to write an essay, and these will vary to some extent in length. My first piece of advice is to write clearly. If we can't read it, we can't mark it, and we have no special tools to help us make sense of writing that simply is illegible. My next piece of advice is to think about structuring your response to some extent. I know you don't have a word processor in the examination, you can't go back and edit things easily, so a basic amount of structuring will suffice. For example, write an introductory paragraph, often defining any key terms in the question. Use paragraphs when writing your main response. If the question asked for your judgment, then summarize key arguments at the end before concluding. Finally, try to keep the examiner on your side. Follow the instructions at the beginning of the exam and the instructions in each question. Now let's see if we can apply many of the things that we've been talking about. We will analyze an examination question from IRM and give you the chance to see how I would break it down and go about answering it. So we'll put it all into practice and walk through a real question. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes to read this question. Interestingly, this question would carry 25 marks. You would answer one of 4 questions. This would be one of them on, for example, Module 3. So it's about a quarter of the paper, so we'd probably expect to think about it for at least 45 minutes or so. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is read through the question again, and this time I want you to analyze this question from the perspective of the examination command words we've talked about, those verbs that Bloom might use to indicate the expectation in the way that you answer it. So read through again and jot down on a piece of paper the different command verbs and count how many you can find in this question. In a minute or so, I'll launch another poll for you, and I'll ask you to indicate whether you think there are 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 different command verbs in this question. So have a look now, write them down and count them up. Okay, so I'm going to launch that screen again for you in a minute, and you'll simply be presented with an option to put 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 in there. So again, as before, it would be great if you could participate by clicking what you think the answer to be. Remember, it's anonymous, so don't worry. We're just looking to see what you think at this stage, and then we can use that to discuss and analyze this question further. So the screen coming up now. Okay, I'm going to give you another 10 or 15 seconds to finish entering your answers. I can see many of you have already answered. Another couple of seconds in case you haven't done it yet. Okay, I'm going to close this now, and I will now share with you the interesting results that everybody found. And the majority answer, as you should be able to see, was that there were 5 of those command verbs. 6 out of 10 of you put that down. 1 in 10 found an extra one, and a few of you only found 4. There were in fact 5, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. I'll just hide that screen for you for now. Okay, so we agreed that there were 5, and I'll take you through those now. So, have a quick look at the words in red in the slide, and you should be able to see them in the question. Some people find it useful to underline keywords in the question. You could underline these verbs that set expectations like this, and then think about how you will frame your response appropriately, understanding what these words mean in terms of setting expectations. Incidentally, if you only found 4, then maybe you could have another look at your student handbook and read through the list of command words that you may expect to see. I think it's also useful to underline key concepts, the terms or constructs, the things that may need defining, those special words in our risk vocabulary. It is often useful, particularly as you progress through the diploma, to explain the meaning of these key words. It is particularly important when you are asked to present arguments about something. You can see the importance in a real-world example. Just for a second, imagine there were 2 police officers from different countries observing a moving motor car on the road, and one says to the other that the car is speeding. The other says it's not. This is an argument. It could go on for a long time. It's therefore important to ensure that people are arguing about the same thing. We need to define speeding first. And that's what you need to do often in some of your examination questions, particularly when you're asked to make some kind of judgment or evaluation. It's important to clarify what we mean by the key terms. So before we move on to the next slide, take a look at the right-hand side of the slide. Also, it's interesting to note, a couple of you have pointed out to me while we've been on this slide that they counted 4 because explain was used twice, so we'll let you off if you said there were only 4 in that instance. So in the next 4 or 5 slides, we'll explore each of those components of the question and how we would go about answering those in parts. Okay, so answering this question, as you can see on the left, I've repeated those key words and key aspects of the question, and what I'm going to do with the next 3 or 4 slides is provide some ideas for you on the right-hand side of the slide of what you could have included in your answer. As I've said, it's normally a good idea to start by defining key words. This will help your brain recall more information and start you thinking. When you explain things, try to put them in your own words, but at the same time it's important to use the risk vocabulary wherever you can. Try to be succinct and not use too many words, but provide detail where it's appropriate. Try not to keep repeating yourself, and that shows the examiner you know the important things to say. In this case, define risk identification and outline the risk identification process. You could use words similar to risk identification is defined by ISO 31000 as the process of finding, recognizing and describing risks, or you could cite some other definition. It's helpful if you can indicate in some way that you have used other sources to inform your answer. We call them citations when you refer to particular articles or textbooks. But obviously we realize under examination conditions you won't remember full Harvard references for everything that you've read or even page numbers, and we're not particularly looking for that. But you may just impress the examiner if you can indicate that there is a source for your thinking. You might also in this case go on to describe the risk identification process at a high level, that it's identifying the causes and source of the risk, hazard in the context of physical harm, event, situations or circumstances which could have a material impact upon objectives, and you might talk about the nature of that impact. As this component would have carried something like 10 of the 25 marks, you should aim to write approximately 1 page of your medium font size writer, maybe a little bit more if your writing is big and spacious. Most good answers or essays to exam questions set by the IRM, particularly as you move through the diploma, can normally attain most of the marks with 2 or 3 pages of work. Okay, moving on to the next part. As these two parts are dealing with a similar point, I'll deal with them together. First of all, so we're in the middle of writing our exam answer. My first piece of advice here is start a new paragraph as we move on to answering a different component of the question. It's always good to break up your answer with paragraphs and put occasional line space between it. It does help the examiner to focus on the relevant aspects of your answer, and it does minimize the risk that they'll miss something. Do not be afraid to leave a couple of lines space, and this may help you if you need to insert something later. You should aim to write a little less than a page here for this particular part of the question. Talk about workshops as a risk identification method. So in the next component, we've got an evaluate type question. We need to evaluate why we use risk workshops. I'll just let you read some of the possible answers. So we're thinking about risk workshops. Recall our earlier conversation about the meaning of evaluate. In this case, it means consider workshops as a risk identification method. How good are they at doing this job? We therefore need to see the arguments. What makes them useful? What problems do they present? Then, on balance, make a judgment. In what circumstances might you choose to use them? Try to remain critical and objective. Provide all of the arguments, whether you agree with them or not. Okay, we'll move on to the final part of this question that has the verb synthesize in there. So we need to synthesize advice on how to conduct a risk workshop. I'll leave you for a moment to just consider some of the items on the right-hand side of the slide. And you will have some of your own advice to add to that list. In this case, synthesize simply means create, make, produce, or build something. So write 1 or 2 paragraphs of flowing text, possibly supported by bullet points. Whilst your text should flow as an essay, it's often advisable to answer this type of question using short paragraphs. Again, do not be afraid to put a line break between them, and this will make it easier for the examiner to allocate marks, and thus reduces your risk that the examiner might not see some aspect of your answer. Whilst you should generally attempt to write free-flowing text, there will be occasions where a bullet point will be beneficial, or a bulleted list. Having written an introductory paragraph with advice on how to conduct a risk workshop, you could then break it into this bulleted list. The list should not be of single words in this case, but more bullets containing 2 or 3 sentences. It's okay to underline key words and draw the examiner's attention to those. As I said at the beginning, remember the examiner's human, will be marking many papers, and they'll appreciate you directing them to key points. This will also show that you know what is important. Okay, so far I've talked about the various things you can use to understand the expectations of the examiner. We've talked a little bit about exam design and the thinking behind it in IRM. And we've analyzed a particular question using the command verbs, the risk vocabulary, and talked about things like writing free-flowing essays, how to structure the answer with introductions and paragraphs and a conclusion where necessary, and sometimes where it's okay to use a bullet point list. We'll now consider the marking process. An understanding of the marking process can help guide you in your revision, but also in your essay writing. And as I have said, the IRM process is based upon the process used in many higher education institutions. Okay, I'll give you a moment to digest what's on this slide. Interestingly, just while you're continuing to read that, just noted one of the questions that has been posed while the webinar has been going on. The question is, are we allowed to use different colored pens in order to draw attention, or are we allowed to only use a pencil? My advice, don't use a pencil unless you're drawing a diagram, and even then we'd probably prefer to see it in pen because it's easier to read. And I would certainly encourage you to use different colored pens. Try and avoid the colors that are hard to read, like green ink, but also I would particularly write it in black ink, but perhaps have a blue ink pen and a red ink pen to underline things. Definitely most examiners will appreciate you providing some kind of formatting or structure in this way, as it is a written paper, and it'll help both of us in the process. So thanks for that question. So once I or other examiners have written an examination as a draft, it is submitted for moderation. This means that other examiners will review the examination to ensure it is fair. This process often takes a few weeks. Once it has been agreed, that is the exam paper, and accepted by IRM, it's published. That means they send it to be printed. It's then distributed to the examination centres around the world, and I'm sure, as Barbara will agree, it's quite a mammoth exercise. It's then time for you to play your role, and you will then sit the examination. The script will be collected at the end of the examination and returned to IRM, who then have to process them, send them out in bundles to all the relevant different examiners wherever they are, and this is then the start of the first stage of the marking process. The first marker judges your script and allocates a mark. As an examiner, when I mark an IRM examination script, I do not know who has written it, as I only see the candidate number. So it is anonymous, and I don't have a list of who is what candidate number and so on. Only IRM keep this. The first important thing for you to know is that technically every student could be awarded a distinction. And you can see the score you need to get for a distinction at the bottom of the slide. There are two main ways that institutions in higher education can go about marking. The first method, and I'll stress this is not the method that's used by IRM, but you may have heard of it before, the first method is called normative marking. And this is a type of marking whereby only so many people can be awarded a certain grade. Effectively, members of the student population are assessed against each other. That's not how we do things in IRM. We adopt a system that's used in pretty much all of the universities, and that's called criterion marking. Criterion marking is where we break the question down into components and allocate marks to it, and as long as you meet the criteria, you get the score and the relevant grade. That means technically everybody could get a distinction if everybody does perform to that standard. Okay, so once the scripts have been marked, then they're returned to IRM. They then break them down into samples, and they'll take some of the marked scripts and send them on to another different examiner for second marking. This again ensures a fair process and that marks have been allocated appropriately. Later, the examiners will meet to discuss all of the exams before the final marks are awarded. So as you can see, providing you score over 49, you're going to pass the examination and progress nicely through your diploma. If you score below, then you will fail it and presumably want to resit it at a later date. Okay, Stephen, so over to you at this stage, I think, and for some reason the slide's not moving on for me.
Okay, let me see if I can move it on. No, we seem to have stuck. Here we go. Okay, well, Phil, thanks very much indeed for that. As excellent. There's some really very useful explanations of the whole process, looking at it from the student's point of view, and some really marvellous advice. We have had a number of questions come in to us, both in advance of the webinar and during as the webinar has progressed. And Phil is going to address some of the key ones which we think will be of most relevance to the majority of participants. So I've got the first one here, Phil, and it's this. I have read a couple of different books while studying with IRM. When providing answers to the questions in the examination, is there a preferred source that I should quote in order to obtain more marks? I'm asking this question because there are sometimes minor differences in the way the two authors have tackled the subject. What's your response to that, Phil?
Well, this is a good question and is really about what you use and draw upon to support your answer. And as I've already indicated, we're looking for you to draw more upon the core readings than your own particular experiences, though that can also complement what you're drawing on. It is important to remember that the examiner will not necessarily expect full Harvard referencing for any quotations that you may use, and that generally we are looking for answers that are in your own words but demonstrate a good use of the risk management vocabulary. It is also important to remember that a key requirement of postgraduate qualifications is to demonstrate wider reading and to build that into your critical thinking. What this means is you should not restrict answers to things you have read in a single book, but are encouraged to demonstrate you have read many different things and can draw upon all of them to help you with your answer. You should also think about the command, the Bloom verb used in the question concerned when deciding what sources to draw upon. If it is a word like to describe or explain and this kind of lower order memory recall kind of thing, then you may draw upon fewer resources to provide an answer. However, if the question starts with compare and contrast or includes the word critical in it, and other of the verbs, then it is likely that the examiner wants to see evidence of wider reading, so use multiple sources. There will rarely be a preferred source that should be quoted, though you would be encouraged to draw upon suggested and recommended readings first, as opposed to something that the study guide has not referred you to. Referring to books and articles not mentioned in the study guide can be a good idea, but this should, if appropriate, take place after you have first discussed any relevant information in a book or article suggested in the study guide. So show you understand those first, They are not in priority order, or they don't have a higher level than any other of the books, so draw upon all of them and then maybe complement that with some other things that you've read, and then further it may be appropriate in some cases to complement it with your experiences. Back to you, Steve.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. That's really helpful. Okay, another question. Would it be beneficial to draw diagrams in order to represent different risk management standards when answering the questions? And is there a preferred framework that gets me more marks?
Okay, yes, again, another good question, and I'd like to talk a little bit about diagrams. With regard to diagrams, some questions will specifically ask you to draw one, whilst others may not. Certainly, when a question asks you to draw a diagram, even if you have already provided relevant text in your essay, you must provide the diagram. And every year, it's really frustrating to not be able to give some students marks because they've not done it and the question specifically asked for it. So in some cases, you will receive credit from the examiner in presenting a diagram, even if one was not asked for. But you should not spend too long creating a diagram in this case. Unless specified, as with referring to textbooks, no one diagram will have precedence over another. That is to say, if we were drawing a diagram of the risk management process, unless a particular diagram is asked for in the question, you would be free to choose any relevant representation. As with textbooks, I would encourage you to first consider any diagrams that you have seen in the recommended or suggested reading. The reason for this is clear. Above anything else, your primary job is to convince the examiner that you have both attained the module learning outcomes and mastered the content of any suggested literature. Back to you, Steve.
Great stuff, Phil. Thank you. Okay, we've got a third question here, and this is a question about allocating your time during the examination. The question is, what is the best strategy to be adopted when tackling exam or question parts?
Yes, I think time management during the examination is a key thing for many people. We don't want to run out of time, but we want to pick up the marks as quickly as we can as we write. So how much to write and how to allocate your time during the examination are questions we frequently get asked as examiners in IRM. First of all, you should be familiar with the instructions at the beginning of the exam that identify the total amount of time allowed for the examination and how many questions you are expected to answer. You should know this before you enter the examination, and you should have thought about this and the implications. If the marks are evenly distributed, as they are, for example, in Module 3, i.e. each question carries 25 marks and you need to answer 4, then you should simply divide the total examination time by the number of questions and allocate this to each question you attempt. So you would spend approximately 45 minutes on each question. You should move on to the next question once this time is up, but should leave a little bit of space in the answer booklet to enable you to go back and add more should time free up later. Remember to start each question on a new page. We don't charge extra for this, and it does help you and the examination team. One of the main reasons for doing this, i.e. moving on to the next question after a set time, is that it is normally easier to pick up most of the marks when you first start writing the answer. As you write more and more, it becomes harder and harder to pick up the remaining marks. So my advice is pick up the easy marks first. If you've run out of time on a particular question, don't stay with it, move on to the next question and see if you have time to go back later. The next thing to consider when attempting a specific question is how to allocate your time on that question. Once again, you can adopt a similar approach. Some questions will be clearly broken down into parts, and you should use the allocated marks as an indication of the amount of time to spend on that part of the question, and also how much to write. So if we determine a need to spend 45 minutes on a question that's in 3 parts, if each part carries a similar score, then we should be spending about 15 minutes on each part. I do see examination scripts where students have not moved on to a question because they ran out of time. In most cases, it is obvious that the student wrote too much on the question attempted at the cost of losing an opportunity to pick up easier marks on the next question. Back to you, Steve.
Okay. Well, there are other questions, but I think we've run out of time to really address them properly right now. But don't worry. We're going to send copies of these questions along with Phil's responses in the follow-up email that all participants will receive tomorrow. So you won't miss out. You won't miss out on the questions that your colleagues and peers have asked, and Phil's response to them. So it's time really for Phil to wrap up with just a few closing remarks now. So over to you once again, Phil.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, we're almost finished. I'd like to leave you with a few final pieces of advice. Firstly, read the instructions. If it says answer must begin on a new page, then please do that. Similarly, fill in the question numbers that you've attempted on the answer book. Analysing the question carefully should help you to meet expectations and therefore obtain the score and credit you deserve. However, every year I see several essays where the student simply does not answer the question. As you are writing your answer, imagine you are the examiner and ask yourself whether you would give marks at this point. Keep checking that what you are writing is what the examiner is looking for. The type of essay you write will be dependent on the command verbs used in the question. Finally, don't leave things too late. Do the reading. Get plenty of practice at writing essays and ensure your writing is legible, well structured, and keeps the examiner in mind. More people tend to pass than don't. Those that pass tend to be the ones that have read and understand the whole set of resources provided by IRM. There are no shortcuts, and experience alone will not be sufficient to pass the examination. You must demonstrate your understanding of the module material and resources and your attainment of the specified learning outcomes. A final comment from me. Good luck. Though I hope, having listened to this webinar, you will realize luck has little to do with it. You will make your own luck by putting the work in and attending to the points raised in this webinar. Thank you for taking part.
Well, and back to me. Thanks, Phil. Thanks ever so much for a really superb presentation there. I'm sure that well, people who didn't witness it will get a great deal of value out of the recording that's going to be available. But I'm sure that all the people who attended today are going to come back to it again and again because it's such a rich source of great well, information and advice. I'm just going to round off with a brief reminder of some key resources that that students can access. And the first one, of course, is the study guides, which I'm sure you're all familiar with now. They really are the spine, the core of your learning on the modules, providing you with very well-written introductions to all of the topics, as well as lots of guidance on further reading, many case studies in the risk in the real-world examples, and some basic learning activities and self-assessment questions to help you really get to grips with the subject matter. The student handbook is also a fantastic resource covering aspects from basic study skills through to exam and revision skills, as well as containing the sort of hard information that you need relating to regulations and rules and so on. So another vital resource which you should, I'm sure, go back to time and again. And finally, the Exam Skills Handbook, a great work from Sarah Cottrell, who is a specialist in study and assessment, and this is a book that you could well benefit from if you were to access it. So once again, thanks everyone today for joining us. Thanks, Phil, for a great presentation. And we just finish with wishing you all great luck in your studies and examinations. Thanks very much indeed for attending today. We'll end the webinar now. Thank you.